Hello there, I'm Greg Sadler, and I'm really excited and happy to tell you about a great learning opportunity that we have coming up in my online Study with Sadler Academy. One of the things that people say to me in emails and social media and comments is, man, I wish I could take a class with you. Well, you can. I'm going to be offering an 8-week online course meeting on Saturdays for 90-minute class sessions. Starting on Saturday, March 29th, we're going to go through 6 really great Platonic dialogues. We're going to start with the Ion, the Meno, then we're going to go into what's often called the last days of Socrates. And I'll tell you a little bit about each of the sessions in just a minute. What I do want to highlight right up front is that this is a class for anybody. You don't have to have a background in Plato or even philosophy. I'm the instructor, so if you've seen me at work, you know that I have a talent for taking difficult philosophical texts, making learners comfortable with them, showing them what's going on, engaging in dialogue with them, and they come out learning a lot. I've been teaching introductory level students now for over 25 years, both in academic settings and for lifelong learners. So if you've ever wanted to study these Platonic texts, I'm an expert guide and I'm happy to work with you so that you can get the most out of reading them. So let me run you through our curriculum, which I'm really excited about. Week 1, we're going to do kind of an introduction to Platonic dialogue, some overview stuff, and then we're going to look at one of the shortest of the Platonic dialogues. So we're getting our feet wet, but it's a really important one. It's called the Ion, and it's Socrates talking with this guy, Ion, who's a rhapsode. He explains Homer, and he's not good at explaining other poets, as he tells us. Why is this important? Well, it shows us what's going to come up later on in the Apology, Socrates engaging in his practice of questioning, what's often called the Socratic method. So we're getting an introduction to it in this short dialogue. There's also a lot of other important themes like, well, who actually knows anything, what's going on with poetry, interpretation, and even the notion of enthusiasm getting conveyed from the gods to the poet, to the rhapsode, to the audience plays a role in that. So that's week 1. Week 2, we're going to begin looking at the Meno. Now that's a longer, more substantive dialogue. We're going to spend 2 weeks on it. The very first part of it, we're going to look at, well, who is this guy Meno, and why is Socrates talking with him, and what are they actually talking about? And the question is, what is virtue? Meno says that he knows what it is. Socrates says, okay, tell me all about it. And they go through several different possible definitions. We get to see Socrates engaging in the activity of trying to seek out definitions. And the question is, do we know anything? Do we learn anything along the way? And it turns out if we pay close attention, we actually learn a lot, not what virtue is, but about the virtues and about a priority between them. We'll also see Socrates talking about his own method and its effects, and we'll get introduced to what's called the Meno paradox. Then in week 3, we're going to come back to the Meno, and we're going to go deeper into the dialogue. We're going to look at something that's often called the doctrine of recollection, which means learning is actually recollection of things that our souls learned at a different time. We'll talk about whether that's really feasible or not. We'll look at the geometric proof that Socrates carries out with an ignorant, illiterate servant boy. And then we get to another really interesting topic. Do the politicians, who may have virtue or not, do they actually know what virtue is? Can they teach it to other people? Or are they actually engaging in kind of a lucky guesswork that Plato calls by the term right opinion. And we're actually going to see some foreshadowing of Socrates' trial as another character comes in and gets all mad at Socrates, Anytus, one of his accusers. So that's week 3. Then in week 4, we start the sequence that leads up to the trial and the death of Socrates. So we begin week 4 by looking at the dialogue, the Euthyphro, and we're going to look at this rather enigmatic character who says that it's pious for him to prosecute his father for murder of a slave. And then Socrates is going to ask him, well, what is piety? What is holiness? And they're going to try out a number of different definitions. We're going to learn some things along the way. For example, what is it that human beings and even gods get angry about because they disagree and they can't reconcile these disagreements with each other? And we're going to run into the so-called Euthyphro dilemma. We'll look at what's actually in the text and what other people in the present day make of it. And then we'll finish up by talking about an alternate conception of piety that doesn't actually work out that well, that of service to the gods. Then in week 5, we're going to jump into something that's less of a dialogue, more of a speech, but it's still rather dialogical, and it contains some parts that are essentially cross-examination of Socrates' accusers, mainly Miletus. Socrates was brought up on charges of impiety, that's why he was talking with Euthyphro about it, and corrupting the young people of Athens. We'll see Socrates defend himself against that, but first we'll see him give his intellectual origin story and talk about his divine mission, which leads him into ticking off his older accusers, the politicians, the poets, the rhetors, and the craftspeople, by engaging in Socratic questioning of them. Socrates' trial doesn't go well, and we will see him at the end making some consolation arguments to his friends about why death might not be a bad thing in general and why it would not be a bad thing for Socrates himself. Then in week 6, we're going to fast forward in time to the Crito narrative time, that is. And there we've got the namesake, Crito, coming and saying, I've bribed the guards. Let's get the hell out of here, Socrates, because you're going to die tomorrow or the next day. So let's get while the getting's good. And Socrates says, well, let's think about that. Is that the right thing to do? And Crito's going to make some arguments, and Socrates will not just make counter-arguments, but remind Crito of some really important points of Platonic philosophy. Should we listen to the many, or should we listen to those who actually possess knowledge, the wise? Should we be concerned about what the many can do or what they can think, or should we stick to the principles that we've worked out in our life? This is when you're really tested. And then Socrates does something really striking. He brings in some other characters, the laws of Athens, and says, here's the arguments the laws could make. Crito, I don't know how I could actually answer these arguments. So it's a dialogue within a dialogue. And then finally, week 7 and 8, we're going to look at one of the greatest of the Platonic dialogues, one that gets me every time, the Phaedo, which takes place on the day of Socrates' execution. He is spending his last day with his friends in his jail cell before he has to drink the hemlock and die. And so he's going to discuss a number of matters. So in week 7, we're going to look at a number of matters that aren't so much arguments about life and death, but more about other things. So he's going to talk about the danger of misology, which is similar to misanthropy. He's going to talk about the real philosophical nature of temperance and courage. He's going to talk about the relationship between the body and the soul and how the body is kind of a prison for the soul. And we're going to talk as well about the ethical status of killing yourself, of committing suicide. Then in week 8, we're going to go to the very heart of the dialogue, which is a number of arguments that are made for and against the immortality of the human soul. Socrates is going to make a number of these arguments, and we'll look at each of them, figure out whether they're good arguments or not. Two of his interlocutors, Kebes and Simmias, are going to bring up some concerns that they have about whether the soul could actually be a harmony of the bodily elements so that when the body dies, no more soul, or that the soul could be like a weaver with a cloak, and eventually the cloaks outlast the weaver who makes them. And Socrates has some responses to these. And we'll finish up by looking at how Socrates dies and what it is that he tells us in a myth about the afterlife. So those are the topics that we're going to be exploring through wading through these wonderful Platonic dialogues together. I will be doing some, lecturing, but we'll do a lot of discussion as well. And we'll think about whether these have applications to our own 21st century existence or whether this is something better left in the past. I provide all of my students with a lot of useful handouts to help you remember the concepts and arguments. We record all of the class sessions, and learners who are enrolled in the class retain lifelong access to all of the class resources, including the recordings. We'll be meeting for roughly 90-minute class sessions with lots and lots of room for question and answer, for raising objections, for thinking about examples, and for engaging in dialogue ourselves about these wonderful Platonic dialogues. So if you've ever wanted to take a class with me, or you've ever wanted to study the Platonic dialogues, or if you want to do both, this is a great opportunity that I think you probably want to take advantage of. And I hope that you'll join me for what's going to be a really interesting and fun class.